So in today's class, we are going to discuss about the constructors, and as like a method, constructor is the same like definition. Actually, when I ask what is constructor, so it is like a method definition. Set of statement together is called the constructor actually. So the same statement, and we have to understand if both are having the same statement, then what is the difference between constructor and when to use the constructor, that we have to understand. So we will move forward to real time and we will see it, and we will create the constructor and we will see how the execution will happen. So let me create a new project, create new Java project. So this is constructor demo, right? Constructor demo. Set the project, go to SRC, create new class. In this method, we are going to discuss about the difference between method and constructor also. Okay, so create new class, demo. And here, as I told, instead of creating the package, while creating the package, while creating the class, you can add the package name. Right, I have added it. So here I have created the class. So now, small difference between a method and constructor that we have to remember actually. So one thing is, when you create a method, you can use any name that you want. So when you create a method, there is no restrictions for creating a method. You can use any name for a method. Where for a constructor, we have to use the class name. This is must and should. We have to use the class name. So this class name is demo. When I create constructor, the constructor name should be demo. Okay, point number 1 is done. When you create a constructor, say same name of the class name that we have to give for constructor. First important point, when you create a constructor, same name, whatever the name that you have provided for the class, the same name we have to provide for the constructor. Point number 1 is done. So now, here few more things we have to, like when we see the difference between a method and constructor, you can see here I can add the public demo. You can add the access modifier, that is public. But here earlier we wrote the void, right? That is return type that we have discussed. In this constructor, we don't have the return type. So this is the major difference between method and constructor. What is the major difference? Method having the return type, where constructor does not have the return type. Method having the return type, where constructor does not have the return type. Access modifier, that is your choice. If you wanted to add the access modifier, you can add it. If you don't want it to add it, you can remove it. And second important point, constructor name always same as class name. Point number 2 is done. Now, third important point, methods will have static method, non-static method, abstract method, non-abstract methods. Where constructor, we don't have that many types. So only vary between this constructor is parameters will be changed. So what I'm trying to say, only thing you can achieve method overloading using the constructor. Apart from that, we cannot perform the static operations or abstract operations with the constructor. So method overloading you will not understand because we are not completed the OOPS principle, but we will recall anyway while discussing about method overloading. This what is constructor overloading. These things will be going to discuss in that class. So here, whatever the other things that we can discuss in this constructor class, I will discuss. So here, so why we are writing the constructor and what is the use of constructor that we have to understand. We understood what is constructor. Constructor having the set of statement and constructor having the same name as a class name, and constructor does not have the return type. And why we are creating the constructor. Okay, so if I'm writing set of statement like this, int x equals to 10 and int y equals to 20 and int z equals to x plus y, and system.out.println z value we are printing here. Okay, so this contain couple of statements that you have written inside the constructor. So here you have the data types, you have the variable constants, apart from that statements, all combining together is called constructor. So let me write a main method to execute the constructor so that we will understand what is the difference between method and constructor. So earlier I have written one method. Let me write the same method here, public void add and I'm writing the same content here. Okay. So now what I'm doing actually, I'm creating the object for the class. Demo object equals to new demo. Right. Now what I'm doing, I started executing this and we'll see what will happen. Here to differentiate which one is printing, I'm adding some line of statement. Okay, this content is from constructor. Right. So let me run this and we'll see what is happening. Here you should observe one thing. So what is the thing is, when I'm running this Java class, I am not calling this. By default, whatever content was present, that is executed. So what we have to understand here is, the moment you create object for the class, while creating the object for the class, constructor will by default execute. You no need to explicitly call the constructor. So if I wanted to execute this method, the same line of statements is present. But if I wanted to execute this method, I need to call explicitly. So here, if I wanted to execute the add method, object dot add, we have to write. And when you run this, okay, so it is printing like this. So now you should have understand the difference very clearly. When you wanted to execute something by default, the moment we create the object for the class, that code we will keep inside the constructor block. So when you write the constructor for any class, so whenever you create an object for that class, that constructor will be called, and whatever contents that you are writing inside the constructor, that will execute. So this is what constructor is called. That's why I created the constructor and method to differentiate and to explain clearly what constructor will do, how the lines of code will be executed, and how the add inside the lines of statement will be executed. So this is the difference between method and constructor. When we wanted to execute some statement by defaultly, then we will create the constructor and we will add that statement inside the constructor, so that the moment you created the object for the class. So my doubt is, if I'm not creating the object, will the constructor content will execute? It will not execute. If you don't wanted to create an object, but still you wanted to execute something, where we have to keep? We have to keep in the static block. If you are adding that content in the static block, then that code will be executed even if you are not creating the object. So will the static method will call by defaultly? No. For static method, the initialization will be done during the compile time, but execution will not be done. Whenever you call from main method, that time only static will execute. And now we have to see a couple of scenarios. What the scenario is, first we discussed about the static methods when we discussed about the methods. Now we will see whether we can write the static constructor. Important point, they will ask in interviews. So we cannot create the static constructors. So static constructors are not allowed. So static constructors are not allowed. It is clear. And the second important point, can we have the final constructor? So I'm writing final constructor. Final also not allowed. So these are the major difference between the methods and constructors. So final constructors also not allowed. You mean these are the two reserved words and non-access modifiers, and you cannot use this non-access modifier to declare a constructor. Final constructors are not allowed and static constructors are not allowed. Right. Next important point, can we have the private constructor? So we are not discussed about the private, public, those are the access modifiers. This is one of the access modifier which is having the accessibility and functionality. When you write a private keyword, that means that thing can be accessible within the class. Outside of the class, you cannot access it. Here we have to understand private constructors can be written. So what we have understand here, we can write the private constructor. The private constructor, we can write it. So now what we understood, like for a constructor, we cannot create the static constructors, we cannot create the final, but we can use the private access modifier and a public access modifier and a protected access modifier and a default. If you are not writing anything, that is default. So we will discuss more about what is the accessibility of private while discussing the access modifiers. Right. So now another important point, when we write the methods, we have written like int x or something like this we have written. That means we are able to send the values, that is called inline parameters. We have the inline parameters that we can pass to the methods. Now my question is, can we pass inline parameters to constructor? Here is my question. can we have the inline parameter for the constructors? So the answer is yes. We can have the inline parameter. Only thing you cannot return using the constructor. Void statement is not allowed, but you can send the values. How we are sending the values to method inline parameter, the same way we can send or pass the inline parameter to constructor. Here you can see I am passing int a and I am printing that value and need to see whether that value can be printed or not. But here only one condition we have. Okay, so only one condition we have, that condition we are going to discuss. So now, when the constructor have the inline parameter, when the constructor have the inline parameter, then what we have to do here, let me show you. So here I created the object like demo object equals to new demo. Okay, you can see now it is giving the error. And what it is saying is, boss, this class is having the constructor and that constructor requires the inline parameter. That means while creating the object, it is mandatory to pass the inline parameter that is required for this constructor. Otherwise, you cannot create the object, because this constructor will execute by defaultly. So that is the reason we have to pass the value to this specific constructor. So if I am passing like this, it will start execute. The reason, because whatever the content are the statements that you are writing inside the constructor that required this inline parameters. So while creating the object for that class, it is mandatory to pass that value. Otherwise, you cannot create the object for the specific class, right? So what we have understood here, constructor will have the inline parameters. Constructor will have the inline parameters, but whatever parameters required to whatever parameters that was present in the constructor, that values need to be passed while creating the object. That values need to be passed while creating the object. Right? While creating the object, whatever parameters that is required for that constructor, that we have to pass. Otherwise, it will give the compile time error. So what we have understood here, when you create a constructor, you have to pass all the values. Now, another important point. So will constructor allows only integer data type, or can we send the different data types? Right. You can send different data types, objects, or collection classes, anything. So this inline parameter will be anything. You can pass the object, you can pass the collection classes, you can pass the any primitive or non-primitive data types, arrays, list, set, whatever. If you wanted to pass that, you can pass it, right? Next one, can we have the multiple constructor in a single class? My question is, can we have the multiple constructor in this class? Yes, we can have the multiple constructors. You can write the multiple constructor. If you see now, if you see this, let me write another constructor. Okay, so here I'm writing another constructor. Here I'm not passing the any value, right? Here I'm printing. This is constructor. And let me execute here and let me show what is happening. Here you're passing this scenario. I will explain first. All right. So I can write the multiple constructors because same name. Here you can see the same name constructor. Here also same name. But how Java compiler will understand which constructor has to be called? Bit tricky question. How Java compiler will understand which constructor has to be executed? You can write the multiple constructors, but here if you see line number 31, we have written, hello, this is constructor. This content has been executed because JVM decided to execute 31 line. So how JVM will understand to execute the specific constructor, right? So here that inline parameters will decide which constructor has to be called. So here you are not passing any value and this constructor does not need any value. So now that means while creating the object for this class, that means boss, you can execute line number 30 constructor because this guy is not passing any value. That means he wanted to execute constructor which is not having the inline parameters, right? So that you have understood. And if I'm passing 20 value here, and if I'm passing 20 value here, and you can see executing the first constructor. So here what you have understood is, boss, we can have the multiple constructors and only one constructor will be executed. Multiple constructor cannot be executed one time because this will decide which constructor has to be executed. If you are passing this value, it will call the first constructor because this constructor, for executing this constructor, it requires the parameter, integer, and value is 20 that we are passing from here. And to execute second constructor, we no need to pass anything, only create object that will be executed. Here, my question is, if in case this constructor also is having the same parameter, okay, so now what will happen? It will give the compile time. I will tell you why. Because you have two red color balls and the same weight and same color. I am asking you to pick one red color ball which is less than another ball weight. So you will not get the one ball because both are same weight, same color. You cannot identify which one has to be picked, right? The reason because the both having the same properties. Here also this constructor having the same property, integer a, and this constructor also requires integer g. Variable name may be whatever it may be, but here the data type is same. You can write different data type, that is allowed. JVM will understand this constructor needs the string data type. They are passing one parameters, but this is string and it is integer. And you can differentiate, like you can pass the multiple parameters for the class like constructor, and you can pass one parameter for the another constructor. This is also fine. But if both constructor having the same number of parameters and the same data types, then we will get the compile time error. We cannot have the same number of data type, same number of parameters and same number of parameters and same data type. This is not allowed. We have to differentiate. So here you are passing the two integers and here you are passing one integer. So that means if we are passing the two, then first constructor will be executed. And if you are passing one, second constructor will be executed. Here only. So to differentiate, we will write something to show you. Okay. Right. Right. So let me print here. See, this will be executed because you are passing the two parameters. So this is all about the constructors, right?